Hello everyone and welcome to the May Livestream Q&A. This is Andreas and I'm so glad to be doing this on a Saturday morning. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to all of the Patreon subscribers who make it possible for me to do this, and all of the YouTube members who get fantastic emoji in our live chat. Try them out. We are going to get started in just a second. Just wanted to quickly check in the chat room, see if everybody's settled in. Pull out your popcorn. We're going to have some fun answering your questions. And I'm going to be sharing the Slido code soon, so you can start asking questions from the live audience. And we'll get started in just 1 second. Let me check in the chat, see if people are having fun. Oh, it looks like people are having fun. Hello from all over the world. Let's go straight to our first question. And as we start with our first question, check it out. Over here is the code if you want to ask your own question. Now, keep in mind, we already have a lot of questions. So if you see a question that is close to yours, but obviously hasn't been asked in the perfect, most eloquent way that you are about to ask it, vote for that question instead of asking another one, because if you split the votes across two questions, then it doesn't get answered. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. So I'm going to be answering about 10 to 12 questions, and I am going to be picking the questions as I see fit, although the votes do help me figure out what people are most interested in asking. So again, this is where the code is. Use it to ask your question, or preferably to vote for one that's already been asked. First question comes from Sam. Today, I tried putting a fake Bitcoin address in the Blockchain Explorer and it told me there was no match. But when I put a brand new unused address in it, it recognized it. Does my wallet broadcast a new address? Sam, no, it doesn't. Your wallet does not broadcast a new address. What you were seeing there was the fact that the Blockchain Explorer decodes the Bitcoin address you put in, and because that Bitcoin address contains a checksum, it was able to notice that the address that you put in as a fake Bitcoin address didn't have a valid checksum. Now, you can create a fake Bitcoin address that has a valid checksum, but doesn't actually have a private key behind it. And people do that. Those are usually called burn addresses, and they're used to destroy Bitcoin, basically, because if you send any Bitcoin to it, it's unspendable forever. However, you probably didn't do that. So when you entered a fake Bitcoin address, you either probably modified one slightly or just entered some characters that look like a Bitcoin address. And that won't fool the Blockchain Explorer. It won't pass the checksum test, so the Blockchain Explorer will tell you that is not a correct address. When you do put an address from your wallet, the checksum checks out, and the Blockchain Explorer knows about that address is real. It may never have seen it on the blockchain. So it's important to understand that wallets generate keys and addresses completely offline. And unless you've had someone send money to an address, the entire world doesn't even know that that address exists. Your wallet does not communicate with any servers to say that it has created an address. That's a completely independent function because it's basic arithmetic. It generates a random number, and from that it generates a public key, double hashes it, generates a Bitcoin address, puts the right checksum in, bingo, you have a Bitcoin address. Now this question is very similar, so I decided to answer both of these together. Dave asks, if I mistype a Bitcoin address to send funds, will the transaction be rejected by the network as a typing error? Will it result in an invalid address format due to use of the checksum as part of the address format? This is a bit trickier because the question you've asked is very specific. Will the transaction be rejected by the network? No, it won't. And the reason it won't be rejected by the network is because there is no address transmitted to the network. So addresses are a user interface thing inside the Bitcoin system. What is actually sent in a transaction is a pay-to-public key hash script, which basically includes the double hash of your public key. Now, a Bitcoin address is the double hash of a public key, but it is encoded in base 58 character set and has an additional checksum. The double hash of the public key itself is simply a number, and it doesn't have a checksum. So if you put an incorrect double hash of a public key inside a transaction, the network has no way of knowing that that doesn't correspond to an actual public key. There's no way to know that that was in error, unless, of course, it's not the right length. But the number itself doesn't really include any checksum whatsoever. So the network will not reject a paid-to-public key hash script that corresponds to a public key that doesn't exist, or the hash has been modified in some way. However, and this is important, you don't get that far unless you write a poorly written script to create that transaction, because you never enter a double hashed public key. What you enter is a Bitcoin address which has a checksum. And all of the user interfaces, the wallets that read that Bitcoin address, in order to decode it into the double hash of a public key that it represents, have to calculate the checksum. Every library that decodes Bitcoin addresses does that automatically and will reject Bitcoin addresses that don't have a correct checksum. So the wallet software, the user interface, the web interface that you're using, whatever interface you're using to enter a Bitcoin address that's creating the transaction, will reject an incorrect Bitcoin address, a mistyped Bitcoin address. But if somehow you bypass all of those checks and you simply enter a incorrect or misentered double hash of a public key into a transaction script, the network has no way of knowing that and will not reject it. All right, our next question comes from Zoltan. Zoltan asks, when SegWit 1, what is the current roadmap to introduce Taproot, Schnorr, Eltoo, and other improvements to the Bitcoin protocol? All right, Zoltan, a few clarifications. SegWit 1 is the second version of SegWit because programmers start indexing from 0. And so SegWit 0 was the original SegWit that was introduced in August of 2017. And SegWit 1 is the next iteration of that. The version 1 introduction of scripts, SegWit scripts, actually introduces 3 features: Taproot, Schnorr signatures, and tap script. It doesn't contain the necessary opcode changes to implement Eltoo, which is a layer 2 improvement for the Lightning Network. So when is all of this happening? It's happening when it's ready. And the initial review of the Bitcoin improvement proposals, which, if I remember correctly, are 340, 341, and 342, or some number like that, have already been completed. And the code is already being tested and continues to be tested and is in review. It hasn't been merged into Bitcoin Core yet. And even after it's merged into Bitcoin Core, it will not be activated until an activation process is selected. There's still an ongoing debate about how SegWit 1 should be activated, and the current consensus seems to be leaning towards a miner signaling with a flag day style activation, which basically means that miners can signal readiness to activate it sooner than a set date, but at a set date it becomes active. However, that date is likely to be 2 years out from the introduction of SegWit 1 in the code, which means that it could be quite a while before we see the introduction of SegWit 1 unless the miners activate it much, much sooner. This is a slow and conservative process, as is all development in Bitcoin. All right, let me see what's happening in the chat, if everybody's happy with how things are going, and then we'll continue with more questions. All right, looks like we have 220 people already joined. Thank you so much for joining. I guess this is also a good opportunity for me to thank the people who support me in order to make this a reality, to do ad-free, neutral content, educational content without corporate sponsors, without advertising, without any of that bullshit, by supporting me through a monthly subscription. And so I'd like to say that all of my patrons are the bee's knees. But especially Bitflow, Brownian Motion, Dex Hector, and Yes2 Crypto, who are the highlighted patrons for this month. Thank you so much to all of you, and all the rest of you who are supporting me on Patreon or through YouTube memberships or direct crypto donations. You make it possible for me to keep doing this work. Now, you may be wondering, what the hell does the bee's knees mean? And that's an obscure British expression which means you're great. The bee's knees are apparently the greatest thing on Earth. I guess someone checked with a microscope and deduced that. Next question comes from Ian. Hi, Andreas. Many Bitcoin block explorer websites will list the name of the mining pool that mined a specific block. How are these sites able to determine this information? My understanding is that blocks contain no identifiable information. That is correct, Ian. There is no identifying information included in a block unless the miner chooses to put identifying information in the block. And what you're seeing in these block explorers isn't the mining information or the information about the miner. It's the information about the mining pool, as you correctly noted in your question. And there's a big difference between the two. But basically, the mining pool has the option, if they choose to tag their block with an identifier by including some characters in the beginning of the Coinbase. Specifically, the input side of the Coinbase has enough space to put some data in it. This is the same place that Satoshi Nakamoto put the Times of London, January 3rd, 2009, chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. That message was put in that part of the Coinbase transaction, and that part can be used by miners and is used by miners for a variety of things, including adding nonce information to cycle through possible nonces for the proof of work algorithm, but it's also used to tag. And mining pools tend to put an identifier in there, just a few characters long, that says the name of the pool or something like that. And over time, people have collected these identifiers and put them in an algorithm that looks for these specific identifiers that are known and allocates that block as mined by that pool, which is what you see in block explorers. And of course, the unknown tags are simply put in as unknown. I remember many years past, there was kind of no real way of doing this in a consistent manner. So I contributed a pull request that actually put all of the information about mining pool tags into a machine-readable JSON formatted text file that allowed anyone to do additional pull requests to add new identifiers if they found some, thereby allowing us to crowdsource effectively the identifying tags so the block explorers could be more accurate. And since then, we do have better results from that. So that's how we know which mining pool has tagged a block. All right, the next question comes from Hans. I get the 1 megabyte blocks and scaling with Eltoo, layer 2 narrative. However, I can't see this working globally. Say 1 billion people use Bitcoin and there are 7 transactions per second on layer 1. Each person gets to do a layer 1 transaction every 4.5 years. Possible solutions, and won't making these take forever? That's a great question, Hans. I think one of the big misunderstandings in this entire scaling debate is the idea that there is a solution to scaling, and once that solution to scaling is applied, there are no more solutions, or they don't need to be any more solutions. There is a silver bullet to scaling. There is no silver bullet to scaling. Scaling is a process, and it is a process that is undermined by its success, meaning that as soon as you successfully scale to be able to support more users, more data, more applications, that attracts more users, more data, and more applications, at which point you're back to square one because you now have to scale more. And rinse and repeat, preferably for decades until the number of users, the number of applications and uses that you can support with any protocol really has enabled some very interesting applications, use cases, and major adoption. So layer 2 is not instead of scaling the base block size, and it is not instead of other solutions. It is perhaps as well as. The decision that was made in 2017 was to focus on SegWit first instead of a block size increase. And of course, other forks of Bitcoin made other choices in that particular case. And then use that to develop layer 2, because SegWit was a prerequisite to developing layer 2 by fixing the transaction malleability problem, and also enabled a small amount of optimization on transaction sizes within the block. So that was a stopgap measure, and importantly, it was a measure to enable the development of layer 2 solutions. That doesn't mean that layer 2 solutions are the end, or that we don't need to scale the base block size. In fact, they're not the only scaling solutions we have, and Schnorr signatures will introduce another level of optimization, reducing signatures. Signature aggregation may introduce another degree of optimization, etc., etc. Now, eventually, all of this may lead to the necessity for doing a base block size increase at some point in the future in order to enable even more scale. And at that point, that base block size increase will be magnified, if you like, by all of the other scaling solutions. So if you increase the number of transactions on the base block size, you can obviously open and close more channels on the second layer, which means that that increase is magnified or multiplied by the second layer. Another thing to consider is that we are also looking at the possibility that exchanges and decentralized exchanges will use batched Lightning channel opening transactions and Lightning payments in order to do withdrawals or onboarding of users. So rather than sending you Bitcoin through an on-chain transaction, an exchange could allow you to withdraw directly to a Lightning channel, thereby onboarding you onto Lightning with an existing channel in a hub, if it's a hub and spoke system, or with a batch transaction that opens many channels to many users, thereby enabling them to get on board with the Lightning network and start using it. And of course, that would save on fees and enable a single transaction to have lots of channel openings and closings. So we don't know yet how all of these different solutions will compete for scaling, but layer 2 is not the end, and it's not instead of additional scaling on layer 1. Absolutely not. All right, let me take a quick break for some water, and I'll put the moderation policy up on screen again so you can enjoy that really fun XKCD cartoon while I drink some water. And we're back. Let's see what our next question is going to be. Salim asks, node counts fall to 3-year low. This is from a headline in CoinDesk. Why are nodes turning off? Is it getting harder and harder to run Bitcoin nodes with block sizes exceeding the rate of technological improvement? Salim, I mean, this is the argument for delaying scaling on layer 1 of the block size, is that it discourages people from operating nodes, and without many people operating nodes, the degree of censorship resistance of the network, as well as the amount of power that miners hold, become problematic. So the network becomes less resistant to censorship, and at the same time, miners become more powerful because they don't have the check and balance of economically important nodes and nodes that are in use by their users to decide on the consensus rules as well as miners. So that's the primary argument for why scaling was done in that way. Now, the decrease in the number of nodes can reflect a number of different things. I think one of the things it reflects is that when the price of Bitcoin declines and people lose interest or they find it less economically viable to run nodes, then they turn those nodes off. And so there's a lack of excitement and enthusiasm when the price is low. And of course, the headline says node count falls to 3-year low. I mean, what happened in those 3 years? Oh, right. Yes. We hit a massive peak in price, and then we entered the trough of disillusionment, I believe, as it's called. I can't pronounce that word. So why are nodes turning off? Who knows? Probably just a degree of disillusionment, but you know, the next bull run, they come back. Now, the other thing to realize is that in writing this headline, CoinDesk is using a specific metric of nodes, which are nodes that are listening on port 8333, which are publicly accessible. And that's a narrow measure of nodes because there are many, many nodes that are using network address translation and do not have open ports listening on 8333. There is another broader measure of nodes which is kept by people who are collecting a database of IP addresses that are currently being advertised as running Bitcoin on the peer-to-peer network. This is the inventory or INV command. No, or is it the... No, it's not. That's the inventory, sorry. Inventory is transactions. ADDR, peer-to-peer command, which gives you addresses of other peers that you can discover. It's the way that on the peer-to-peer network you discover other peers. And if you collect those, we see somewhere between, if I remember correctly at last count, 50 to 60,000 nodes identifying themselves currently on the network, vis-a-vis, I don't know, 7,000 to 10,000 nodes that have open ports on 8333. So how do you measure this? It's not a very good measure, but certainly it is expensive to run a node. You have to have significant investment in hard drives. It is difficult because of bandwidth constraints, and it's expensive in terms of bandwidth to run a node. And it's also time consuming, you know, doing the maintenance, making sure the node is up and all of that. I spend lots of hours per month running Bitcoin nodes and Electrum servers and Lightning nodes and things like that, doing a lot of sysadmin work. And it requires both expertise but also time and effort. So that may be why we're seeing the node count go down as well. Anonymous asks, I saw your speech at the Anon Summit. Do you plan to release it, and do you have any more thoughts about how the narrative of society is overdue for a change? Yes, we're going to be releasing that on June 20th is the current schedule, I believe, and we're going to be making the necessary announcements and sending out links and publishing it on YouTube soon enough. We're going to be doing a live premiere, which I hope to see you in the chat for my keynote that was delivered at the Anon Summit, I think it was a couple weeks ago, maybe less. And how the narrative of society is overdue for a change, well, you know, you'll have to watch that keynote again to hear some of my thoughts there. But the bottom line is that we're seeing a lot of traditional institutions fail to scale and fail to solve problems. And when things that are supposedly the solutions to problems or mechanisms for governance or institutions for supporting society solutions to problems are not solving problems, why do we have them exactly? Inertia, appeal to tradition, inability to see other possibility. And so, yeah, it's time to go. It's time to go find better ways of doing things. It's time to progress and innovate and discover new opportunities for governance. Let's see, what else? Next question, again from Anonymous. Different Anonymous, perhaps, from the previous Anonymous. Might be the same Anonymous. That's the whole point of Anonymous. Anonymous asks, with ASICs, the halving, and lots of large-scale mining operations, is there still any point in individuals running just a few current generation miners if electric is affordable at about 7 cents, I'm assuming that's per kilowatt hour, and the goal is primarily to accumulate Bitcoin? What a great question. I love that question because you'll be surprised by the answer, perhaps. And I've changed my mind over time. I had some very interesting conversations with one of my patrons in a recent happy hour about this exact topic. And the answer is yes, there is a point. And the point of running a few modern ASICs, perhaps in your garage or in a garden shed, or maybe as part of your central heating or water heating system, is that you are able, through mining, to acquire Bitcoin at perhaps not the most affordable price. Maybe it costs you a bit more than the current spot price in the markets when you pay for it in electricity. But what it allows you to do is two very important things. One, you're acquiring Bitcoin without fees and without any loss of privacy. So there's no transaction fees. When you acquire Bitcoin through mining, you also don't lose any privacy. It's completely anonymous. You can do it from anywhere in the world, so it's a great way to acquire Bitcoin. The other reason, which is even more interesting, is that pardon me, is that acquiring Bitcoin this way gives you pristine virgin Coinbase Bitcoin. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that Bitcoin's fungibility is not great. It's not perfect. The degree of privacy is not great, which means that every coin you acquire comes with a history. And when you acquire it from an exchange, that history has been vetted and authorized and approved by the government. But of course, also that means that it's also closely attached to your identity, and that's very dangerous. But if you acquire from other sources, the Bitcoin might be tainted. And tainted may mean that instead of being touched by criminals like JP Morgan Chase, it's being touched by criminals like your local pot dealer. And of course, you know, we like some criminals, we don't like others. That's the regulatory system we live under. So if your Bitcoin has been tainted by a pot dealer instead of JP Morgan Chase, then you may have difficulty using it in an exchange. Whereas if you acquire it through mining, now you have Bitcoin that is completely pristine. It has literally no history. And that's a rather interesting thing. At the moment, there's no premium for Bitcoin that is pristine, as far as I know, although it's something that comes up often. People say, oh, maybe there should be a premium, or maybe sometimes there is a premium. People talk about these markets where you can buy pristine Bitcoin. I haven't really seen that in practice. But I do know that there may be a premium in the future, especially if fungibility issues become worse, if privacy becomes worse, if attacks against Bitcoin become worse, if Bitcoin tainting becomes worse. All of those reasons might make pristine Bitcoin carry a premium. So that's one of the reasons why you might consider doing this. Question from Enrico. How's it going, Enrico? Thanks for asking more great questions. Enrico asks, hi, Andreas, what are the worst practices to store Bitcoin? I love this question because I often get asked the opposite, which is what are the best practices to store Bitcoin? And I've talked about that extensively. So thank you, Enrico, for giving me the opportunity. What are the worst practices to store Bitcoin? I would say the absolute worst practice to store Bitcoin is to store it on a custodial service, meaning they have the keys and you do not. That is accessed primarily through a web interface and does not have two-factor authentication. I would put that at the absolute top of my list as the worst ever way to store Bitcoin. If you store Bitcoin on a custodial service, you don't have the keys, and it's accessed through a web interface, which means that you have to type a username and password into a browser, which may or may not be at the correct site, which may or may not be on a computer with a keylogger or Trojan. And there's no opportunity for two-factor authentication, or the two-factor authentication is laughingly simple, like SMS-based text message two-factor authentication, which at this point in the internet security history is criminally negligent to have SMS as your two-factor authentication, which is why it's preferred by all of the banks. Then in that case, you are at huge risk of losing that Bitcoin. It can be stolen by the exchange. It can be stolen by someone in the exchange. It can be stolen from the exchange. It can be stolen when someone sniffs your password from your browser using a Trojan. It can be stolen when someone simjacks your phone, or if you don't have two-factor authentication, or so many different ways it can be stolen, and you will have absolutely no recourse. So if it is stolen, it's like, whoops, sorry, gone. All right, so if a custodial no two-factor authentication web interface is the worst, the second worst would be non-custodial no two-factor authentication web-based, which would include various web wallets like blockchain.info or blockchain.com as it's called today, where, again, phishing attacks are the primary way that wallet is stolen, and it happens so often. So again, that's a very bad idea. You need to add two-factor authentication, or preferably move your coins somewhere else. Third worst practice to store Bitcoin is on a very poorly secured desktop computer using some kind of desktop application in a hot wallet with very little in terms of password. But even if you have a password, if it's on a desktop operating system like, I don't know, Windows 7 that hasn't been patched in years, even if you have a password, it can easily be sniffed by a Trojan or keylogger that's installed on that computer. And so, when you have an operating system like that, the question is not, do I have a virus, but how many and what varieties of viruses do I have? And how much of my information are they currently leaking? So that would be my third worst option. And I think I'll stop there, because from there it starts getting better. So, for example, mobile device applications, hot wallets on mobile devices where you control the keys with a mnemonic, generally pretty robust because the mobile operating system is robust. And then we start getting into hardware wallets and various forms of cold storage, multi-sig wallets, hot, cold, multi-sig, and multi-factor multi-sig, and things like that. So it gets better from there. The first three that I gave you, those are almost guaranteed to make you lose your money. Another question from Anonymous, although this sounds like a different Anonymous from the other two Anonymouses we had before. Is the miner software the same as the full Bitcoin node? No, it's not, although it does use a full Bitcoin node. So generally speaking, mining software is kind of more specialized and lightweight. Most miners mine through a pool, which means that they're using a type of mining software that is pretty lightweight. It gets a block template from the pool, and then it uses, it sends that block template to ASIC miners that are usually connected over Ethernet, and those ASIC miners then crunch away at that block template. You can mine with a full Bitcoin node, and you can connect a full Bitcoin node, but in most cases, that's what the pool does. Some pool protocols allow you to construct your own block template. And in that case, you would then have a full Bitcoin node, because in order to construct your own block template, you have to previously validate other blocks that are coming in and transactions and know what is in the mempool and what has been spent already. Otherwise, you run the risk of constructing an invalid block by including a transaction that shouldn't be included. And so in that case, you are running a full Bitcoin node. But again, you're probably also running some more specialized mining software that talks to your hardware and sends block templates to the hardware. All right, let's jump in the chat and see what's happening in there. I wonder how many people are online at the moment. I can't really see. Let me refresh here. It doesn't seem to be giving me the correct information. 320 people online. How exciting. How exciting indeed. Very good. Let's see. Next question. Anonymous asks, if countries such as Venezuela can shut down Tor and VPN access using packet inspection, could this technique gain adoption among a growing number of countries as a way to restrict access to an open intranet? You know, a lot of countries use packet inspection, or deep packet inspection, DPI as it's called, in order to try to thwart the use of Tor and VPNs. However, it's not possible to shut down Tor and VPN completely, even with deep packet inspection, because there are a myriad ways, an infinite number of ways really, that people can disguise traffic and make it appear like a variety of other things. You can make it appear like a live stream, for example. You can make it appear like DNS traffic. You can make it appear like HTTPS traffic, which is the most common thing, encapsulated. And you can run VPNs and Tor over a variety of other protocols so as to hide them. So deep packet inspection isn't flawless. In fact, the more we do SSL encryption on our everyday traffic, the harder it is to figure out which of that traffic is a VPN inside HTTPS and which of that traffic is just visiting a website. And so countries that do this generally are quite happy with a trade-off where they also end up blocking a lot of legitimate websites because they're trying to go after VPNs, and they don't succeed in stopping VPNs. This is a cat and mouse game, and you know, the mice often succeed, especially if some of them are sewer rats. Oh, another question from Enrico. Hi, Andreas. Is address reuse bringing disadvantages only to the recipient and also to the sender? I cannot prevent someone from sending me multiple payments on the same address. Are they hurting my privacy? Enrico, no, not really. They're hurting their privacy because they're associating multiple inputs that they are choosing to send you to a single output address, which is your address. The fact that you've received 2 payments to the same address doesn't reveal anything more about that address. Obviously, those 2 payments are going to the same address, so we know they belong to the same person. Now, you may have some issues with coin reuse in terms of change. depending on how you manage your UTXO. If your wallet is smart, what it's going to do is it's going to spend both of the UTXO, let's say from 2 different payments that you've received, and then send the sum to a change address when you make your next payment, essentially consolidating that UTXO. It was already in one address anyway. The worst case scenario is if you spend from that address, then they send you some money again, and then you spend in a separate transaction from that address again, which kind of forces you to reuse, but you know, there's not much you can do about that. So there is maybe a small impact, but for the most part, it isn't a really serious problem. Now, of course, this is very, very different from the kind of scenario where you consistently give out the same address, because then you are really impacting your privacy, because not only can different senders see what other senders sent you, but then you accumulate a lot of small UTXO. So for example, in the past, I used the vanity address for donations, and while that was convenient and people had fun with it, and you know, oh, we can send to a one Andreas Bitcoin address, it suffered from a lot of disadvantages in terms of privacy, among other things. It's not a SegWit address, but also when I accumulate a lot of UTXO there, I need to consolidate it and reduce the privacy on my, the impact on my privacy. So I've stopped doing that. I now, if somebody wants to donate crypto to me, they get a separate address in a kind of payment checkout on BTC Pay server. And so I don't have that problem too much. Of course, I can't stop people from sending to that old vanity address anytime. Okay, how are we doing? We've got about 15 minutes to go. We've got about 300 and some people online, and I hope people are having fun in the chat. All right, someone was having too much fun. I see a lot of deleted messages there. Okay, not. Let's see, and we've got a follow-up question. That is a very good follow-up question. Let me just quickly go back to Enrico's answer and add a comment here. Loic has a follow-up to this and saying, wasn't address reuse making it easier to derive the public key? What Loic's talking about here is the fact that if you sign twice for the same, using the same private key, which you would have to do if you spent twice from an address, because the person who's reusing it sent you 2 transactions far apart, and you can consolidate them in a single transaction. That does impact your security, but only in a very, very narrow edge case. And that edge case is where the mechanism used to sign actually is implemented incorrectly. So today, when transactions are signed, the mechanisms that is used is a deterministic signature, which means that instead of picking a random value that is used to do the signature, the value is actually derived from the transaction data in such a way that it is not random, and that prevents the reuse of the R factor in the signature, which in the past, due to buggy implementations, has led to leaking your private key. So the idea here is that when you sign, you need a random number to initialize the signing algorithm. That's called R. And if that random number R is chosen improperly, if it's not random, if it's predictable, and you choose the same R twice to sign 2 different messages, you blew it. Your private key is now easily deduced from that signature. I think that's what Loic's referring to. But no wallet software does that anymore. Wallet software ensures that R is deterministically derived in such a way that it cannot be repeated to 2 different messages with the same R. All right, let me scroll down. This message brought to you by Vernon. Hodl. Hodl, 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 hodl. Great use of the emoji. Vernon, I think we get your point. Let's see. And please ask your questions in the Slido. I occasionally do a quick follow-up. Marius asks, hi, Andreas, how does the banking system work? Marius, the banking system works extremely well for those who already have power, wealth, and privilege. Beautifully. It works like butter. It allows them the absolute freedom to commit fraud and crimes without any repercussions, to do money laundering, which if you have a banking license is apparently without consequences. It allows people who are privileged, wealthy, and successful to do many great and also terrible things without repercussions. The only problem is that means it only works for about 1.5 billion people, leaving about 6 billion people out to dry. People who do not have as much access, wealth, and privilege, and as a result have to deal with substandard, expensive, slow, restricted, and often very risky financial services systems. I'm assuming that's why you asked the question. But for a more detailed explanation of how the banking system works, I don't know if there's any good books. Like, I don't know if anybody's written something like Banking Confidential, you know, like Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, that kind of showed all of the nasty business that was going on in kitchens around the world, in restaurant kitchens. I wish somebody would write that about banking. And, you know, there's so many things that you see when you work in that industry. I worked in financial service, well, in information security and IT for financial services for 2 decades. And the stuff that I saw behind the scenes would very quickly erase the words meritocracy from your brain forever. Someone suggested the Creature from Jekyll Island, Hidden Secrets of Money. I'm sure there are many others that have been written like that. So check out some of the suggestions that are popping up in the chat. Pietro asks, Bitcoin supports smart contracts. Some are simple, such as M of N. More are possible, and yet very few users use them. In the past, you spoke about those uses. Now you rarely do. Do they still matter? Where can someone learn how to write them? Pietro, you're right. Not too many people use them. And the reason not too many people use them is because smart contracts in Bitcoin require custom transactions that are constructed by sophisticated wallets that have user interfaces. And these are not easily standardized or portable between uses. Unlike smart contracts on Ethereum, which can be reused by different wallets, and where standardization of interfaces can occur much more easily. So, you know, as soon as Ethereum made it possible to do things a lot easier for developers and build user interfaces and standard interfaces around them, a lot of people stopped really exploring some of these things. Now, there's some good news here because there are some efforts to improve the viability of the types of smart contracts that Bitcoin can do, because these can lead to very robust financial services. One example of these is a proposal or a specification called Miniscript. And Miniscript is a way of writing, it's kind of a higher level language for Bitcoin script. That's a way of writing reading and reasoning about what a script is doing that is much easier to read, much easier to reason, and even mathematically prove and process. And it's also much easier for a machine to process and to then produce the appropriate Bitcoin script for that type of transaction, which makes the types of smart contracts in Bitcoin much more portable. Think of it as a non-Turing complete Lisp-like Solidity language or smart contract language, but for Bitcoin. In fact, Ethereum also had a Lisp-like language called LLL that preceded Solidity. Not many people used it. It was a favorite of Vitalik's, who wrote the specification. He's a functional language programmer primarily, so he was quite in favor of that. So miniscript is the kind of thing that may enhance the portability, usability, standardization of Bitcoin scripts and allow more rapid development of capabilities. But it's not entirely true that people are not doing sophisticated smart contracts. It's just that a lot of that simply has moved to Lightning. So when you hear about Lightning doing interesting things, that's all happening with these interesting and sophisticated smart contracts that are happening within Bitcoin script. And Lightning development has greatly accelerated the use of various features in Bitcoin, as well as encouraged Bitcoin core developers to introduce more capabilities that are now being rapidly consumed, standardized, and presented to users through the Lightning network. Jeff says, great questions this month. I agree. I'm really happy with the quality of the questions that are coming through. Timotheus asks, hi, Andreas. How can I explain Bitcoin to my parents? And for that, I have a video, actually. I was asked this question by Amber maybe 2 years ago, and Amber, who's been a great supporter, Patreon, and friend in the space for many years, asked me, how do I explain it to my mom? And I did a video on that. It's one of the more popular videos on my YouTube channel. I'm not going to repeat it right now, but I will refer you to that. How do I explain Bitcoin to my mom? Check it out on my channel. Niraj asks, hi Andreas, how is repeated quantitative easing not impacting the US dollar? Is it because of not reaching the consensus for a currency to replace US dollars in international transactions? I see this as one more benefit of decentralization. Comments? Great question, Niraj. Why is quantitative easing not impacting the US dollar? Why is all of this torrent of stimulus and money flowing into banks and then straight out of banks and into bankers' pockets and asset owners and investors' pockets? How is this not leading to inflation, monetary inflation in the US dollar? That's a great question, and what I understand, and mind you, I'm not an economist, but this is my simple understanding of it. In the US at the moment, and for the most part of the decade following 2008-2009 global financial crisis, the US has been in a demand crisis. It suffered with low demand, low consumer spending, and low confidence by consumers to go out and spend, and a very high debt load for consumers that encouraged consumers to save instead of spend. The middle class wasn't bailed out in 2008 and was stabbed in the back in 2020, so as a result, the middle class doesn't have any disposable income to spend, and so people are saving as much as they can. They're preparing for another rainy day because it's been torrential economic ruin for more than a decade now. So what happens then? When the middle class isn't spending, you have a demand collapse. And it's really bad in terms of a demand collapse in 2020. And when a demand collapse happens, that triggers deflation. Deflation is the process of the postponement of purchasing and hoarding of money in order, well, saving of money, if you like, for a rainy day, is the kind of response you have when there's very little confidence there's very little confidence in the economy, not necessarily the money itself. So people still think the US dollar is likely to more or less maintain its value because most of the inflation isn't monetary inflation, it's asset inflation. Bubbles blown in real estate, in healthcare, in stocks, in bonds, in every sector that is financialized, because that's where most of the money is flowing from the stimulus into the investor class that are pumping up the stock market and pumping up all of the asset prices. So consumers, on the other hand, aren't seeing too much inflation in primary goods. They are seeing some. They're seeing most of the inflation in things like healthcare and housing. And so what do? They stop spending. And what happens when they stop spending? We enter a prolonged deflationary period where people are saving and not spending, just like the lost decades of Japan. This deflationary phenomenon is what the Fed is supposedly fighting. But instead of fighting it by providing stimulus to the middle class so that they can spend and come out of the deflationary crunch, instead it's providing massive stimulus to banks, bailouts to massive multinational corporations that tilt the playing field and further collapse demand, causing further deflation. Now, of course, there is a breaking point, and deflation can turn into hyperinflation very, very quickly. Because if at some point you see a situation where there is a loss of confidence in the long-term value of the currency, then people will dump their very meager savings and they will try to convert them into durable savings. Durable savings, which can be quite surprising. I remember, and I've been to many countries where people buy cars because cars are more durable than the fiat currency, or they buy white goods, appliances, washing machines, and fridges and things like that, and wrap them in plastic and keep them in the garage for 5 years because those retain better value. People exit to gold, people exit to other forms, and including probably Bitcoin. We might see deflation flipping into hyperinflation at some point in the future. That's effectively the last stage of the loss of confidence, which is the capitulation of the currency. And it can happen very, very quickly, from no inflation to very, very rapid inflation, combined with stagnation in the economy, which creates this kind of stagflation, hyperinflation trap that many central banks have been caught in, but not happening right now. Still, the petrodollar is still strong. The US dollar is still maintaining its world reserve currency status. And gradually that's changing. The geopolitical situation is changing, but not fast enough to create monetary inflation at the moment. Oh, wow. I think we are good. We've covered everything we needed to cover. And so thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for participating. Now, remember, these videos are ad-free and, of course, free to watch and watch live and republished in multiple languages because of the contributions of monthly subscribers on Patreon and YouTube members here on YouTube. And your contributions mean that myself and my team can keep doing this and doing this at an even greater scale than we've ever done it before. So thank you so much for all of these contributions, for supporting me to continue to do my work. It's what enables me to do neutral, not corporate sponsored work with no strings attached and no shilling. And that's really what I enjoy doing. So you make it possible for me to do that. Thank you so, so, so much. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications. We've got new videos coming up several times a week. And if you didn't know that we've got 4 or 5 videos coming out every week, that's probably because you didn't hit that bell icon and turned on notifications. So subscribe, turn on notifications. As someone said in the chat, I can't smash the like anymore because I've broken 2 phones already. So don't smash the like. Gently caress the like. And please share and help others understand what this technology is all about. Next week, we have a live premiere of an interview I did for the Halving, I believe, which was for the Bitcoin Magazine Halving with Christine Harkin. I'm very excited about that. It was a fun interview. It's kind of reminiscing about the previous epochs of Bitcoin and the current, the upcoming, at that time, Halving. It's got a great slogan in it. It's got some great moments of reminiscing. It was a really fun interview. I'll be in the chat next Saturday for that live premiere, chatting with you and typing as fast as I can while we all watch it together. And that's it. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for hanging out with me today. Bye.